So there's been some cool questions on the YouTube channel, and I thought I'd just start working through some of them to give a sensible answer for, certainly where I can. Some of the questions are quite specific, but there's been a few that come in that I thought would be helpful for anyone to hear the answer to. So I'm going to start with one which is a question essentially whether someone who was blind is going to, if they're going to be in priority need if they approach a council. Now obviously I've done a video on priority needs elsewhere on this channel, and we did the event last year, Trauma, Homelessness and Priority Needs, where Sarah Steinhardt, who's a deputy district judge and a barrister, gave a pretty detailed explanation of what vulnerability means and what you take into account. But I'm going to look at this issue specifically around this kind of idea of whether someone who's blind or partially sighted is going to be in priority need. The first thing to say is that it is not automatic. So this would be a kind of a case of arguing that they are vulnerable because of the fact that they are partially sighted, rather than an automatic characteristic like pregnancy or having dependent children or being homeless as a result of fire or flood or something like that. So when making the approach to the council, and I'll give some very practical tips about that towards the end of the video, essentially what you are trying to argue is that, you know, your person who is blind, you know, your individual who's blind or partially sighted, and we'll talk more about the difference there as well in a minute, but whether they would be more vulnerable or significantly more vulnerable than a hypothetical, ordinary, healthy and robust person would be if they were homeless. So, you know, in one sense it's a kind of a hypothetical exercise. You know, we assume that the person you're comparing your individual to, your client to, your friend to, or whatever, is essentially not going to have any health issues or any significant health issues. So that's your comparator. And the point of the law is that what it's saying is that if anyone became homeless, no matter how resilient and kind of robust you are, you're going to suffer some harm as a result of it. It's going to be stressful, there's no doubt about it. The question within the Housing Act and this idea of priority need is whether your individual is significantly more vulnerable than that ordinary, healthy and robust person would be. And this is a question I quite often, well, we spend quite a lot of time on our online training courses, for example, just talking about. The first question really you want to look at here is the person completely blind, or do they have some sight? Because you know, where they fall on that scale is going to basically change how you would approach the issue, or kind of essentially what likelihood there is of that person being found in priority need. Now, for someone who's completely blind, I cannot imagine that a council can legitimately say that they are not going to be vulnerable under the definition of the Housing Act. But if someone was partially sighted, so you know, it would just really depend on the facts of the case, and that's really the kind of the point of this argument, is you need to focus on, you know, the impact on your individual of that lack of sight for them. So there's two bits of helpful case law which I'll run through very quickly. One was Smith v Haringey and the other was Thomas v Lambeth. Thomas v Lambeth was arguably simpler to understand, but it holds less weight legally, so I might as well just kind of initially focus on the Smith v Haringey case. And in that case, essentially you've got a three-part test, you know, 3 questions to answer as to whether that person is going to be in priority need. So the first thing is, within the Smith test, is, you know, what harm is this person going to suffer if they were homeless? And you can use the example of street homelessness, but it doesn't have to be street homelessness. And so for someone who was completely blind, has taken that example, you know, even if you look at a very basic level, if they're going to be in an unfamiliar environment a lot of the time, the chance of them, you know, having trips and falls and stuff is going to be dramatically increased. So, you know, it wouldn't be too difficult probably to make that argument down that line. But you're also going to have things like, you know, the risk they are of being exploited, for example, because they're obviously going to be very vulnerable for that. You know, and there's various other kind of things, you know, just the practicalities, you know, finding toilet facilities, finding those support services are all going to be things which are going to be considered. And for someone who is registered blind, and as I say, that could include people who have some degree of sight, it's likely that there's going to be quite a lot of information readily available. It's probably, you know, they're likely going to be having some sort of involvement with social services, you know, might be a visual impairment team or something similar to that. Obviously they're probably going to be known very well to their GP, and it may well be that they're also engaging in other voluntary support services. So in Bedford, as an example, we've got something called Sight Concern, which kind of looks at people with sensory impairments. And so really, you know, it's not going to be too difficult to find that information. So, you know, you are going to have to go find it, but it's not going to be too difficult. It's not going to be as complicated as some other arguments you'd have to make would be. So the first question in the Smith test is, you know, what harm would they suffer? And really you're asking the person, you know, what harm would you be afraid of suffering? And they're probably going to be the best source of the answer there, but it might be you get other stuff to put in there as well. The next question would be would a healthy and robust, an ordinary healthy and robust person suffer that harm? So If, for example, you're using that simplistic idea of, you know, the risk of trips and falls because they can't see, or, you know, walking into traffic or whatever, something like that, obviously for a person with sight, that is not going to be a significant issue. So already you're kind of demonstrating there's a significant difference between your client and a hypothetical healthy and robust person. And the final question would be, you know, is that impairment going to make a noticeable difference to their ability to deal with the consequences of homelessness? That's the wording of the case law. And again, you're looking here at kind of things like the ability to engage with services, the ability to go and find accommodation. It's kind of it's the practical stuff that's involved with being homeless. And there would be some considerations here which would have an impact on it. So, for example, a local authority is entitled to look at the support that the family offer, or family or support network would offer. So, you know, if kind of using the analogy with the Hotak case, where essentially the Hotak was a guy who was vulnerable, but his brother was also with him, and his brother essentially mitigated the risk he was at to a point where he was not considered to be in priority need. So if, for example, they had a partner who was going to be with them 24/7 and was going to help them with those kind of everyday living activities that you would have when you were homeless, then the council are going to try and use that argument, and they're going to try to say that actually, you know, that additional support means they are no longer vulnerable. And in that Hotak case, Lady Hale, I think it was, made the point that there's this kind of perverse incentive for family and friends to kind of drop their support away so that the person's left on their own, in one sense, so that they can demonstrate this argument. So, yeah, so, I mean, that's a kind of a complicated way to look at it, but it might be something that you want to bear in mind when you are making that homeless application. You know, what support is available? Is it going to be 24/7? Is it going to adequately mitigate those risks? And it may also be that, you know, the partner themselves have other vulnerabilities. So it's kind of it's something that you just kind of need to look at again on the facts of the case. So that's the Smith definition. The Thomas definition, as I say, is a bit easier. So again, 3 questions. Do they have an identified existing issue? So in this case, yes, they're blind or they're partially sighted. Would that issue be significantly exacerbated by the threat of homelessness or being actually homeless? And again, you know, in one sense, you know, you're not going to become more blind if you were homeless, but it's certainly going to lead to that risk of other issues deteriorating. And this kind of question of vulnerability is a composite test. So you're not looking at just this issue of their degree of sight, but you're also looking how that impacts their other, you know, for example, their mental health. So, for example, if I would imagine that if I was homeless, it would be bad enough. But if I was homeless and blind, then that's probably going to lead to very, very significant anxiety, potentially leading to depression or whatever. So again, that's something which you want to be asking, you know, a doctor or a support network. Again, as a part of that question, what do you think is going to happen to this person? That's part of the answer. It's not just about the kind of the physics of that person's sight issue. It's about them as a whole person. So those are all kind of things. And then finally, with the Thomas test, you know, would that difference make have a significant would that exacerbation lead to an increased risk of harm if they were homeless? And in this case, again, you'd imagine that it would be, because, you know, if, as I say, if you're taking that person as a whole, if they are homeless and blind, their mental health is probably going to take a very significant knock. If they have trips and falls, their physical health is going to start deteriorating through, you know, potential, you know, broken hips and whatever, or, you know, traffic accidents or whatever it's going to be. So that's the kind of the homelessness law side of the question, and obviously more could be said about it, but really also in this case we want to be looking at the practicalities. Are there other things that you can be doing? And more and more often now, what I'm seeing in my own casework is that it's so important to spell out from day one to the council what you need. So it's, you know, it's obviously important to say, you know, this person is approaching the council and they are blind, but it's absolutely crucial that you spell out what that means. You know, what sort of aids and adaptations is that person going to need in temporary accommodation? How does it impact their ability to take in, you know, kind of written communication? Obviously, if someone's blind, they're not going to be able to read written text or whatever. So, you know, you need to spell out what the council needs to do. The council should do it anyway, but they probably won't. You know, many housing officers I know have never had Equality Act training. They don't probably even know what a definition of a disability is. They don't understand that under the homelessness duties, they have various duties under the Equality Act as well to basically try and eradicate, you know, the kind of the disadvantage that person's at. So, as I say, things like, you know, it might be that if the person's going to be in temporary accommodation, it's crucial that the council give the person stable temporary accommodation. It's not going to be moved every 2 weeks, because that person needs to familiarise themselves with their environment. but you need to say it. So you need to kind of almost from day one, you need to say that. And it kind of goes back to making the homeless application itself. More and more, what I'm seeing with these kind of council online forms is that even the ones that are thorough, they still don't give opportunity to kind of give that detail. You know, there's just not enough drop down boxes to actually kind of give a sufficient answer. So again, I'd be saying, you know, in an email, a separate email, you know, this is a homeless application of the title. You are saying, you know, this person's homeless and they need the council's help. That triggers section 184, the homelessness application itself. And then you very quickly want to spell out everything that you can think of that's going to be relevant to that person, in this case being blind. So, you know, as I say, you know, what difference that makes to them attending appointments. How, you know, can they use a phone? Can they use any sort of internet services? How is the council going to ensure that that person can go through the process without it taking any longer and without it taking any unnecessary kind of stress? So those are the kind of things that I'd say from a, you know, from a practical point of view, is that you really need to be exhaustive, and it needs to be an email. Again, don't ever speak to a council on the phone. You know, even if you follow it up with an email which kind of gives the detail, there's so much skullduggery done in the kind of that kind of, you know, kind of transference from verbal information to actual written records. So you want to keep it all in an email. You want to have advocates, you want to have knowledgeable advocates by your side helping you out that process, because these, again, even the good forms on council websites, because they are so vast, it's incredibly difficult to actually know what the answer is a lot of times. And in many councils now, you kind of have to answer all the questions correctly for it to go through. And so you might not just genuinely know what the question's even asking, and that kind of can delay you getting help. So that email that goes through, if you want to, you know, kind of get technical, paragraph 18.5 of the Homelessness Code of Guidance says that applications can be made in any form at all, and they can be made to any department of the local authority. So if you're working or you're living in a local authority where it's just unitary, which means social services and housing are under the same roof, you should really be getting your social worker to do it for you, because that's going to make it easier. But essentially, you know, you should be saying to the social worker, I need the council's help with housing, as a way of kind of increasing the chance of getting, you know, getting the right help. And also, you know, if you haven't already, Section 9 of the Care Act is basically the kind of the gateway into adult sort of care and support stuff, you know, kind of care packages and so on. So, you know, again, you get one of those by just asking your local authority, please assess my care and support needs. And obviously, partial sight or blindness is a care and support need. And again, the council will almost certainly have duties to that person, and that might involve that kind of might dovetail with the housing duties, where actually when the person gets temporary accommodation, the social worker or, so, you know, kind of related services are helping that person acclimatise, if that's the right word, familiarising themselves with the kind of the layout of the temporary accommodation. You know, how they pay for gas and electric, all of those kind of things. In order for them to have a relatively stress-free experience of that temporary accommodation. And it may also be, you know, things like, you know, it may restrict people to ground floor properties, for example. I mean, I don't know, but it could be those kind of considerations as well. So yeah, I think that's kind of what I'd be looking at in trying to answer that question, and hopefully that's helpful. We do run a Facebook group called Homelessness Best Practice, which is a place to ask anonymised what-if questions. So in one sense, this question could have been asked there and probably would have got a good response there. And if you're a professional, if you're interested in this kind of subject and you're in a position to, then we run very reasonably priced online training. If you just search for Homelessness Best Practice on Eventbrite, you'll kind of get a list of events we're doing in the near future. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful.